Welcome to the debate. Think about early map makers drawing sea monsters in the blank spaces of the ocean, right?
Yeah, the classic "Here be dragons."
Exactly. They had this tiny piece of ambiguous evidence. Maybe a sailor saw a large shadow under the water, and suddenly the map claims there is a kraken capable of sinking fleets. Today, we're looking at those blank spaces on a professional's map. Within the living professional record methodology, we call this the evidence to claim gap.
But, the sailor did see something. If the mapmaker just entirely erases the monster and draws empty water, they're hiding a real navigational reality. I mean, the water isn't actually empty.
Sure, but when the Royal Navy sails through that exact spot and finds a pod of whales instead of a kraken, the mapmaker loses all trust. The map is no longer a reliable document.
Fair point.
In the living professional record, the LPR, a claim is basically any statement asking a reader to believe something about a worker. And evidence does not automatically speak for itself.
Right. It always requires interpretation.
So the specific disagreement we are exploring today is this. When a professional's claim outruns its source evidence, should an advisor's primary focus be on strictly scaling down the language to match the literal artifact? Or should that gap trigger an aggressive investigation into context to elevate the evidence and justify the stronger claim?
It's a massive tension in the practice.
It really is. And I argue for strict verb governance. When we see a gap, we absolutely must scale down the claim to protect trust. The rule is simple. Do not make the claim bigger, make the claim truer.
And I take the opposite side. I argue that treating the evidence to claim gap merely as an overreach ignores the pervasive danger of underclaiming. Gap language often signals underclaimed value patterns that require deeper context gathering rather than just an immediate linguistic downgrade.
Let's unpack the mechanics of this. So the evidence to claim gap appears when the claim outruns the source. Say a client drafted an onboarding checklist for one team.
A very common scenario.
Right. That evidence may support a claim about creating a shared onboarding reference, but it does not automatically support a claim that the client transformed company-wide onboarding. The gap may involve scope, authority, seniority, outcome.
Ownership, or just general evidence strength.
Exactly. And the advisor must learn the here gap language. Words like transformed, led, owned, strategic, expert, enterprise-wide, advanced, optimized, executive. These aren't banned.
No, they're just heavy.
They're heavy, and they require evidence. The advisor has to ask, does the record support the level of this word? If it doesn't, we govern the verb down.
But treating that gap just as an overreach creates a completely sterile and, frankly, often inaccurate picture of a professional's actual value. Yes, every claim must answer to the record. I agree with that. But an artifact like a checklist is almost never the whole story.
It's the only verifiable part of the story, though.
On the surface, sure. But if we reflexively downgrade a word like transform to just drafted, we risk erasing a massive contribution. The gap shouldn't be an automatic trigger to shrink the claim. It's really more of a blinking warning light, telling the advisor to map the broader context and identify the true evidence-backed value pattern.
Let's put the listener in the room for a second. If you're an advisor, you have been in this exact situation. The client is looking at you, visibly frustrated, saying, "But I did do this." And you're staring at a one-page Word document, trying to figure out how to bridge the gap without lying.
Because they feel the truth of their impact, even if the document looks small.
But evidence doesn't speak for itself. A checklist is just a checklist. The gap appears exactly when a person tries to stretch that limited evidence across enterprise-wide dimensions. If the literal artifact in the record is a single-page document given to 5 new hires, but their resume bullet says, Strategic Operations Leader Driving Organizational Transformation, we have a massive gap in scope and authority.
Yeah, that's a big stretch.
You just can't pretend the evidence supports that.
Well, you're assuming the artifact is the only evidence. What if that same checklist was adopted across 3 different locations? What if managers provided feedback on it and it became the standard operating procedure during a period of, say, 40% turnover?
That's a lot of what-ifs.
But it happens all the time. In that context, the outcome actually was a transformation of the onboarding process. The physical artifact is the exact same, a single-page checklist, but the context fundamentally changes the claim strength. If you just stare at the Word document and say, well, the strongest defensible verb is drafted, so we will write drafted team checklist, you have entirely missed the systemic value the professional provided.
I hear that, but a spark is not a forest fire.
Oh, come on.
Now, really, just because someone initiated a document, the spark, doesn't mean they own the systemic outcome, the forest fire. Who actually executed that transformation? Did the professional force the other locations to adopt it?
The professional solved the problem so effectively that leadership scaled it. That is informal leadership in a nutshell.
It is absolutely a contribution, yes, but the managers executed the transformation. The professional supported it by creating a reference tool. We have to protect the client from the Kraken moment.
The Kraken moment?
Yet what happens when a careful interviewer pushes on the reality beneath the claim? The interviewer says, "Walk me through how you transformed company-wide onboarding." If the client replies, "Well, I made a Word document, and the managers liked it so much they used it everywhere," the claim instantly collapses. It's way too heavy for the foundation. And when a claim collapses in a live interview, trust evaporates entirely.
But you're assuming the interviewer will see the reality as a disappointment, mainly because you're viewing it through the lens of a rigid title.
Because the market views it through that lens.
Not necessarily. If the professional is coached to say, I noticed new hires were failing due to inconsistent training, so I built a tracking structure that made next steps visible, which stabilized our team so effectively that leadership scaled it across 3 locations, that answer doesn't collapse. It demonstrates profound operational visibility.
But they didn't lead the transformation.
My concern is that by strictly adhering to literal verbs demanding we only use drafted instead of exploring the actual value pattern, we systematically enable underclaiming.
Look, I'm not ignoring the value pattern, but the ownership verb is one of the strongest claim controls in the LPR system, and it has to be exact. Owned means the client had primary responsibility and authority.
Right.
Managed means they controlled the workflow, the team, resources, or the timeline. Coordinated means they aligned people, information, or handoffs, and supported means they contributed to a larger effort. If someone merely supported an effort, letting them use the word led is a catastrophic credibility risk.
It's definitely risky, but
We are living in an era of AI-inflated language that looks incredible on a screen, but disintegrates under human scrutiny. We have to choose verbs for truth, not power.
okay. But the problem with demanding literal verbs up front is that it ignores the psychology of how professionals actually behave in the real world.
What do you mean?
Well, many professionals, particularly those who have been marginalized or who have spent a decade in support roles, habitually hide their value. It's a protective reflex. They are actively punished in corporate environments for overstepping.
That's true, yeah.
So they use phrases like, oh, it was just administrative, or I only updated spreadsheets, or it was a team effort, so I can't take credit. If an advisor hears that reflex, looks at the spreadsheet, and rigidly enforces a lesser verb like maintained, resulting in a claim like maintained team spreadsheet, we have utterly failed that client.
But finding hidden evidence is exactly the job. When a client says, I just helped, the advisor has to investigate. You ask, what did others rely on you for? That question usually reveals the real contribution.
Exactly.
But wait, there's a massive difference between discovering hidden evidence and inflating weak evidence. The spreadsheet wasn't just maintained, fine, but how do you responsibly bridge that gap without basically hallucinating a title? Because the moment you upgrade the claim to manage complexity, you need the record to prove they actually controlled the workflow.
We bridge it through market translation. Let's break down the mechanics of how an advisor actually does this. You have the artifact, the spreadsheet.
Okay.
You investigate the context. High turnover, chaotic environment, no formal leadership. You look at the outcome. Teams were stabilized because they finally knew who was doing what. You take all of that and identify the value pattern. The pattern is reducing confusion and clarifying handoffs. We don't stop there. We translate that pattern into what the market actually calls it. The market calls that operations coordination or enablement. We aren't forcing them into a senior title they didn't hold. We are developing a positioning hypothesis.
A positioning hypothesis is a testable direction, though. It is not a final public identity claim.
No, it's a bridge required lane. We say to the client, based on this value pattern, you may be well positioned for operations coordination roles,
even though you are technically an executive assistant. If that claim is currently emerging rather than proven, that doesn't mean it's false. It just means we've identified the trajectory.
But practically, how do you handle the proof gap? If there is an evidence to claim gap, you inherently have a proof gap. You're missing a metric, you're missing a witness, or you have no applied practice.
Sure.
Let's take the classic scenario. A client wants to pivot to AI strategy because they completed a 6-week introductory AI certificate. The credential proves a single fact: they completed the training. It does not prove the full meaning of being an AI strategy leader. That bridge-required lane has massive proof gaps. You cannot let them render that publicly on a resume.
Of course not. But identifying those proof gaps without shaming the client is vital. A proof gap is just an action item. It tells the client exactly what they need to do next. You want to claim operations coordination? Great. Go capture 3 informal coordination examples from your past emails. Or go gather witness feedback from the managers who used your checklist. It gives them a map.
And while they are closing those proof gaps and gathering that witness feedback, the advisor must utilize claims to avoid.
Here we go.
Yes, every claim map should include guardrails to prevent drift into unsafe or unsupported territory. If the evidence strictly says the client created a team onboarding checklist, the claims to avoid might include transformed onboarding, led HR strategy, or redesigned enterprise talent operations. These aren't negative criticisms. They are protective measures to keep future renderings strictly accountable to the record.
Hold on, I have to challenge this concept of heavily relying on claims to avoid. Is treating strong claims automatically as forbidden territory too discouraging to the professional?
It shouldn't be if it's explained well.
But walk me through how you actually say this to a human being. If you hand a transitioning military logistics officer a list of powerful market terms they cannot say because their military record doesn't perfectly mirror civilian corporate jargon, aren't you just locking them into a direct fit box?
Not at all.
You're stripping them of the vocabulary they need to navigate an adjacent fit lane. An aspirational claim status can guide growth, but only if it's handled with intellectual charity.
I think you're conflating a person's potential with a claim status. Claim status belongs to the claim, not the person. A person is not unsupported. A specific claim they want to make about being a civilian supply chain director is unsupported. A person is not emerging. Their claim about leading AI strategy is emerging.
That's a subtle distinction to a client.
It is, but this distinction protects their dignity while maintaining absolute precision. Look, I am fully in favor of using aspirational claims in private governance. We can build a whole private map of where they want to go. But the moment we move from private planning to public rendering, the claim must be safe, mature, and relevant. The privacy of the LPR dictates how a claim is used. We map it privately, but we cannot render it publicly until the proof gap is closed.
Well, privacy boundaries are critical. I completely agree with that mechanism. Some claims might be fully proven, but entirely unsafe to use publicly because they rely on confidential client data.
Right, like a sensitive merger?
Exactly. You might have run a highly sensitive merger integration. The private claim is accurate, you led it, but the public rendering has to be scaled back to something like supported strategic growth initiatives to protect a non-disclosure agreement. That's a privacy gap.
Right.
But let's stay on the evidence to claim gap. When a professional has done the work, but the artifacts in the record are sparse, maybe they didn't have a formal title, or they were operating in a startup environment where nobody was tracking metrics, the absence of formal evidence does not mean the absence of capability. That's exactly why we rely on value patterns. Value patterns survive the lack of formal titles.
They do, and upgrading from a generic skill label like strong communicator to a grounded value pattern like clarifies complex information so teams can act consistently is a massive improvement.
Huge improvement.
But skills themselves are claims. If a client lists project management on their resume, that is a claim asking the reader to believe something. Where did they use it? At what level? How recently? Under what conditions? If the advisor cannot mathematically tie the evidence to the claim, the advisor cannot govern it, and if we cannot govern it, we cannot responsibly let the client render it.
See, this is where the art of the advisor comes in. When a client lists project management and you ask for evidence, their immediate reflex might be, Well, I didn't have the title, so I guess I don't have evidence.
Exactly. They back down.
The advisor has to bypass that reflex and dig. You ask, did you coordinate weekly task tracking? Did you do owner follow-ups? Did you create deadline visibility for cross-functional teams? If they say yes and they can pull up the emails or the trackers they maintained, they do have evidence of project management. The gap was an illusion. By exploring the value pattern, we bridged what looked like an evidence gap and prevented the tragedy of underclaiming.
But if they tracked deadlines and followed up with owners, then the defensible exact verb is coordinated. The claim becomes coordinated weekly task tracking and deadline visibility. We did not leap from that discovery to owned cross-functional project management. The right verb is the defensible verb. When we choose verbs for truth, the professional never has to fear an interview question. They are totally insulated by the record.
Insulation is valuable, sure, but if you insulate them so heavily with hyperliteral descriptions, they never get the interview in the first place. Market translation is not pretending the client did something else. It is finding the closest responsible language for what the record supports.
But it has to be responsible.
Yes, and if the market calls deadline visibility and owner follow-up operation support, we use that language. We translate. We don't just leave them with a hyper-specific literal description of a spreadsheet that no hiring manager is searching for in an applicant tracking system. The bridge-required lean exists because the market speaks a different dialect than the internal record.
Translation is necessary, I'll give you that. But a translation must remain faithful to the original text. If you translate drafted a team checklist into transformed enterprise operations, you aren't translating, you're writing a fictional sequel.
Well, obviously that's too far.
But this is why the advisor's primary directive in the face of a gap must be constraint. We must hold the line. We have to teach the professional that a claim is not proof. We have to show them that AI output is full of bloated claims that must be aggressively stripped down. Telling the truth at the right level of confidence is the ultimate goal. When we scale down the language to match the literal artifact, we build a foundation of absolute stone.
A foundation of stone is useless if you only build a one-room shack on top of it. If we strictly scale down the language every time we encounter ambiguity, we build a very small house for a professional who might be capable of much more. The gap should trigger investigation first, constraint second.
I still say constraint governs the investigation.
But look for the systemic impact. Look for the informal leadership. Look for the ways they managed complexity when no one else would. If we do that, we ensure their record is not just rigorously defensible, but fully representative of their actual lived professional value.
Well, let's summarize where we've landed. The living professional record relies on disciplined, evidence-governed constraint. The evidence-to-claim gap is a warning light. When a claim outruns its source, the advisor must intervene with precise language governance. We use exact ownership verbs. We map claims to their appropriate maturity status, whether proven or emerging. We utilize claims to avoid as protective guardrails. Closing the evidence-to-claim gap through precise, defensible language is the ultimate protection of professional trust. Do not make the claim bigger, make the claim truer.
And from my perspective, while evident is paramount, we must remember that the gap is often an illusion caused by poor capture of context. An artifact alone rarely tells the whole story. If we reflexively shrink claims to match literal artifacts without investigating the chaotic environments, the privacy constraints, and the systemic outcomes, we risk erasing informal leadership and underclaiming true capability. Exploring evidence-backed value patterns and utilizing responsible market translation prevents this tragedy and allows the professional to navigate their career with honesty and momentum.
Despite our different approaches to handling the gap, there are clear areas of convergence here. We both agree that a claim is not proof and that skills and credentials do not automatically grant full meaning without context.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we both recognize that identifying proof gaps gives the professional a clear, actionable map for growth, rather than just shutting them down.
We also agree that telling the truth at the right level of confidence is the ultimate goal, whether that means pulling back an inflated claim or illuminating a hidden value pattern. We both want the professional to walk into an interview anchored to reality, completely unshakable because their words are backed by the record. I think this debate highlights that an advisor must be capable of both strict linguistic constraint and expansive context gathering. The friction between those two impulses is exactly what produces a perfectly mapped claim.
I encourage anyone navigating this material, especially advisors sitting across from frustrated clients, to continue exploring how these dynamics play out in practice. There's much more to uncover in how the record governs professional truth, particularly how privacy boundaries further complicate how claims are used and rendered.
And as you reflect on this, think back to the map maker we discussed at the beginning.
Right. When you encounter the blank spaces and the ambiguous shadows on a professional's map, you have a choice. You can draw a kraken, which risks everything when the interviewer asks the hard follow-up question and the truth is revealed. You can draw empty water, which ignores the reality of what the professional actually navigated. Or you can dive in, explore the shadow, find the whale, and draw exactly what is there. It takes more work, but it is the only way to make a map worth following.
A map that tells the truth.